Well, good morning to you all. My name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. I'm very glad that we are able to join forces this morning with the Brazil-U.S. Business Council. And we have a number of colleagues, Kathleen, Diego, from the Business Council here with us. For this event on the private sector perspective on Brazil's energy and infrastructure challenges, central theme in Brazil today. But before I continue, I just wanted to recognize two people that are in this room that give us great pleasure and wonderful to see back at the Wilson Center, if only for a few days. The Brazil Institute senior scholar, Professor Leslie Bethel, dear friend, who is here to participate in a very important ceremony today, which is the presentation of the Kluge Award to former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a man very much associated with not only the creation of the Latin American program of this institution in '79, but also with the creation of the Brazil Project in the year 2000 that eventually became the Brazil Institute. So very glad to see Leslie here, and very glad to be holding this event in such an important day of celebration of one of Brazil's greatest statesman. Also with us, Noela Invernizzi, who was here a fellow at the Science and Technology program, but we hijacked her for the Brazil Institute, and she will be forever associated with us. And she helped us a lot in one of our series on innovation policies here. So very gratified to see both Noela and Leslie with us this morning. The event today, as I mentioned, a private sector perspective on Brazil's energy and infrastructure challenge. And we are glad and we are honored by the presence of Carlos Cavalcanti, Director of Energy and Infrastructure at the Federation of Industries of the state of São Paulo. It is the most important industrial federation in Brazil, and as you probably know, São Paulo is Brazil's powerhouse. São Paulo produces around a third or more of Brazilian GDP. Carlos has been involved in with FAPESP for a number of Fiesp for a number of years. And he directs different parts of Fiesp, including a very important, he participates in a very important part of Fiesp, which is SENAI, which is a National Industrial Training Service. You have the bios with you, Carlos. So I will just say a few words about each of our participants or speakers this morning. Reeve Wolford, Managing Director of Latin America for Autrios Group. Reeve was previously associated with the Brazil-U.S. Business Council, has been a good friend of ours for a number of years. And I believe this is the first time he participates with us here at the Brazil Institute as a speaker at this location, so I'm very glad to welcome here. And then a dear friend, Christopher Garman, Director at Eurasia Group, and head there at Emerging Market Strategy and the Latin American practice. Chris has been a very dear and good friend of mine and of the Brazil Institute for a number of years now, has participated in many of our events, is a person on whose advice we rely on. He, in his capacity as a lead analyst on Brazil and emerging market strategy at Eurasia. He covers a range of areas that we are going to cover, that Carlos Cavalcanti will cover in his presentation, especially on energy, but also in infrastructure. So with that, and we would start. We are live on webcast, so I would like to welcome anyone and everyone that is following this proceeding. If you that are people that are not in the room wanted to ask a question, I think you can send it to michael.darden@wilsoncenter.org or to the Brazil site, and I will. It will be brought to me, and I will read it during the Q&A. So we structured this with Carlos starting us off with some 15 minutes of observations and comments, and then followed by Reeve and Chris. Carlos, you're welcome to start, please.
Paulo, thank you very much for the invitation of the Woodrow Wilson Center, for your personal kindness, for inviting me to be here this morning. I also would like to extend my thanks to Reeve and Christopher and to all of you here in the audience. I see too many young people here, but with the age, it's common that we see every time people that are younger than
people are
us.
becoming younger. That's an amazing thing.
Really. Anyway, thank you all for coming here this morning and to listen to my words. The economic geography of the planet in recent years has been marked by a shift that has turned the spotlight on countries that little more than 3 decades ago were not considered economically relevant when compared to the great powers that led the world at that time. Brazil has acquired in recent years a new international profile, anchored on solid economic policy, microeconomic stability, and robust social policies. The country has grown consistently, generating quality jobs and progressively decreasing social inequality. In 2011, Brazil became the 6th largest economy in the world, surpassing the United Kingdom and trailing only the US, China, Japan, Germany, and France. However, this internal effort cannot be disassociated from our foreign policy. Thinking about the future of Brazil requires thinking of the common purpose of South American unity. Our region is undergoing an important moment in its history. With a territory of 18 million square kilometers, it occupies 42% of the Americas, accounting for 6% of the global GDP. Despite the global financial crisis of 2008, South America saw the rapid recovery of its economies. Between 2002 and 2010, all South American countries experienced an economic growth of around 5% a year, while the world average during that same period was 3.8% a year. Between 2003 and 2010, the growth of GDP per capita was above 24%. This growth is reflected in the average Human Development Index of the region, ranked as high by the United Nations in 2011. Despite this significant growth, the continent has still different levels of development. One of the biggest challenges in South America in the 21st century is to establish a modern infrastructure network that creates links amongst different areas, integrates supply chains, and boosts sustainable development. Infrastructures is understood, therefore, as an essential tool in achieving this desired unity. The creation of the Union of South American Nations, UNASUR, in 2007 began the current process of political integration among all countries of South America, and it is focused primarily on promoting energy integration and infrastructure development. Fiesp sees integration as a key element in advancing the insertion of Brazil and the region into the global context. Because of its continental dimensions, the transportation infrastructure sector is vital to the sustainable development of Brazil. Highways are the predominant in the Brazilian transportation mix, accounting for almost 60%. Yet the country has a greater potential to develop a balanced and diverse array of different modes of transportation, combining competitive prices, low emissions, and logistical rationality. The extensive coastline, the large network of navigable rivers, allow, for example, a major expansion of water transportation. The railway system, which represents only 25% of cargo handled in the country, has strong growth potential. As can be noted in this graph, in countries with continental dimensions, the share of railways is between 40 and 80%. This imbalance costs Brazil money. According to recent surveys conducted by Fiesp, Brazil's logistics costs represent about 10% of GDP, well above other countries of similar territorial dimensions. As a way of balancing the Brazilian transportation mix and reducing logistic costs, substantial investments are needed. Brazil invested in 2010 only 0.7% of GDP in transportation infrastructure, pointing the need for a significant increase in investment to enable economic growth. Studies conducted by the Institute for Applied Economic Research of Brazil show that to mitigate the current bottlenecks, approximately 3% of GDP should be directed to infrastructure investment over the next 5 years. To achieve this level of investment, strong private sector participation is essential. Things have started to change. The most recent example was the concession to the private sector of the management of 3 of the largest airports. It is up to the private sector to allocate the necessary funds to the transportation industry, bringing innovative technologies and efficient management models. Above all, as a way of coping with this unbalanced transportation mix and high logistic costs and increasing investments in the sector, Brazil has not limited itself to only looking within its territory. The physical integration of transportation infrastructure in South America appears to be an effective solution given the great logistical challenges of our region. In 2009, UNASUR created the South American Council of Infrastructure and Planning, COSIPLAN. The year 2011 saw the establishment of an Integration Priority Project Agenda, also known as API, focused mainly on the transportation sector. All 31 strategic projects will surpass more than $21 billion in new investments. The year 2022 is set as the deadline for its completion. The construction of 3 transoceanic corridors is a highlight. The first corridor will be between the north of South America and connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean through roadways and waterways, crossing the Amazon forest through its natural network of navigable rivers. In the center of the continent, a railway corridor will be built, running from the port of Santos in Brazil, crossing the continent through Bolivia, reaching the ports of Ilo in Peru and Arica in Chile. The last corridor in the south of the continent entails the construction of a railroad that will run from the seaport of Paranaguá in Brazil, pass through Paraguay and Argentina, and arrive at the seaport of Antofagasta in Chile. Furthermore, the connection of the continent to the Caribbean Sea will be enhanced through improvement and paving of roads between Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, and Venezuela. Brazil aims towards a physical, political, and strategic integration of South America and strengthening of the region by fostering the growth of all UNASUR member countries. This integration also aims to share knowledge and technologies that further the independence of this Union of Nations, which is also being accomplished in the telecommunications industry. I refer to the execution of the Atlantic Submarine Cable System, a Brazilian project that will enhance the connection of South America to the United States, Europe, and Africa through 5 submarine optical cables. The project is estimated at $884 million for a total of 24,000 kilometers of submarine cables, with operational startup scheduled for 2014. As can be seen on the map, the first segment will stretch from Fortaleza in northeastern Brazil and connect to the United States. The second, about 6,000 kilometers long, will connect Fortaleza to Angola and can later be extended to other BRIC countries like Russia, India, and China. The third also stretches from Fortaleza to Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, integrating the optical cables to the 2 Brazilian cities with the highest international data traffic. The fourth segment will connect Fortaleza to Portugal in Europe, and the fifth will stretch from São Paulo to Uruguay and Argentina, with a view towards the integration of the South American optical ring as follows. The optical ring is a strategic project for UNASUR. The goal is to extend networks up to the borders that do not have connection points and then interconnect them, which will facilitate regional integration. Currently, an email sent from 2 neighboring cities of Brazil and Peru, for example, needs to come to the United States by the Atlantic Ocean and then down to the Pacific to arrive in Peru back again. There is a journey of 8,000 kilometers to travel a distance of only 300. The conclusion of the whole project is scheduled for 2015. Another initiative for regional integration lies in the effort for the adoption of a digital TV standardized system promoted by Brazil. In 2007, Brazil adopted the Japanese standard, becoming the first country in South America to transition from analog to digital. Since then, Brazil has urged other countries in South America to do the same. All of them have done so, except yet for Colombia. Moving towards a single standard across the region would reduce the cost of production of stand-alone converters and televisions with built-in converters. Energy. Negotiations on climate change and development culminated recently with the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio +20. It is important to note that 2/3, or 66% of global emissions of greenhouse gases come from energy production. Looking here at the global energy mix, we can see that 81% of the entire planet's energy is produced from fossil sources. In contrast, the energy mixes in South America and Brazil are characterized by the strong presence of low carbon sources. 31% of all energy produced in South America comes from renewable energy sources. Brazil reached a staggering 48% of renewable energy in its mix, which is nearly 4 times the world average. The most widely used source to generate electricity in the world is mineral coal, the largest emitter of CO2. 2/3, or 67% of electricity generation in the world is based on fossil fuels of high CO2 emissions. On the other hand, in South America, 56% of electricity production comes from hydropower generation, the cleanest and the cheapest energy. According to a study by the European Commission, power generation based on coal emits 878 kilograms of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. In contrast, hydropower plants emit only 6 kilograms of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. Today, over 84% of Brazil's power comes from hydropower. Brazil is currently utilizing just 30% of its total hydropower potential. FIES believes that the available water resources in the world should be fully used in hydropower plants, making sure to offer environmental and social compensation. Countries in the region already benefit from water resources through strategic alliances, as in the case of Itaipu, the binational hydroelectric plant between Brazil and Paraguay. South America, as a whole, has enormous hydroelectric potential, which should be the basis for the expansion of its electrical systems. Even so, 70% of the region's water potential is yet to be tapped. Brazil's 82 gigawatts of installed hydropower capacity is efficiently used by a wide and fully connected transmission network. If these transmission lines were not connected, the installed power capacity would be 20% greater than the existing one. The so-called isolated system area, which basically comprises the region of the Amazon rainforest, represent only 2% of the Brazilian consumption. However, in this area, this is an area that has hydropower potential yet to be exploited of more than 100 gigawatts, which will force the expansion of the interconnected system. Due to its economic size and experience in operating and trading in the world's largest interconnected system, Brazil can contribute significantly to defining a strategy for energy integration in the region. Energy interconnections are considered essential for the integration of South America since the Guayaquil Consensus signed in 2002. In it, South American countries emphasized the strategic role of building a regional energy infrastructure for its economic and social development. In 2007, the South American Energy Council was created, one of the main objectives of which is to promote energy security. Energy exchange strengthens energy security as it reconciles generation potentials and the complementarity of their systems. It contributes to a reduction in energy costs and greenhouse gas emissions and promotes increased access to energy, furthering sustainable development. Biofuels. Brazil has the largest biofuels program in South America and the second in the world, with annual production of 2.6 billion liters of biodiesel and more than 22 billion liters of ethanol. Brazil adds 20% sugarcane ethanol to its gasoline and, moreover, has adopted the flex fuel engine in 94% of its car production. This type of engine allows the use of gasoline, ethanol, or any mixture of the both. The biofuels program in Brazil also adds 5% of biodiesel to fossil diesel. It is not only Brazil that is adding biofuels to fossil fuels. Many South American nations have mandates to reduce reliance on fossil fuels and environmental pollution. Brazil is the undisputed leader in the region for the production of ethanol, followed by Colombia and Paraguay. In the production of biodiesel, Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia stands out. The National Agency of Petroleum, Natural Gas and Biofuels indicates that Brazil also has large reserves of natural gas in its continental shelf, as stated in recent research. Exploitation would enable the country to quadruple its current daily production, becoming one of the largest natural gas producers of the planet. Another study, released by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, predicted huge reserves of unconventional natural gas in South America, particularly the Vaca Muerta Reserve in northern Argentina. In order to ensure the viability of these large reserves, as well as to secure regional supply, a 1,500 kilometers gas pipeline is to be built in northeastern Argentina. This pipeline will connect the Argentinian system to the relevant gas reserves in Bolivia. Another important interconnection in the region is the Brazil-Bolivia pipeline, in operation for 13 years, which guarantees the supply of 30 million cubic meters on a daily basis to Brazil. The 2007 pre-salt discovery is an important development. The challenges posed by the great depth of these reserves have created several opportunities in the region, in the petroleum and natural gas sector. To reach these deposits, it's sometimes necessary to go through more than 2 kilometers of the ocean, 1 kilometer of post-salt rock, and the last layer of salt, which can be up to 2,000 meters thick. Finally, the pre-salt hydrocarbon reserves are located between 5,000 and 7,000 meters deep in ocean waters. The forecasts for these reserves already reach 120 billion barrels. Venezuela's oil reserves have the potential to be the largest known in the world. Brazil and Venezuela's combined production enhance South America's status as an energy power. South America stands out not only for its infrastructure development potential, but also for its increasing integration efforts. We have gone beyond trade agreements. We are fostering concrete progress in infrastructure. We seek to foster equality among our neighboring nations. We prefer soft power. The severity of the global financial and economic crisis is known. Looking further ahead, the scenario is of total uncertainty. Openness to international trade and increased economic integration among countries is still an alternative to the current crisis. It's time to change the paradigm. South America has had enough of beautiful words and unclear goals. We are moving on to more ambitious goals. By doing this, the future will be less uncertain. Let us seize this opportunity and reap great benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you for this very comprehensive presentation about plans, potentials, and now we are going to ask our two commentators to offer their views on what they just heard and saw, and obviously ask also the questions that they may have for Carlos.
I'd like to begin by recognizing that I've now reached the requisite degree of gray hair to appear at as a speaker at Wilson Center events. I've been out in the crowd for many of them, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak. I'm with a company called Altrius Group that is a consulting firm and a government affairs firm, and do a good deal of work with the Brazil-U.S. Business Council on a number of its working groups. And so the closeness that with U.S. companies that are invested in Brazil and companies also from other countries that are invested in Brazil gives me some perspective on how investors are viewing the opportunities that Carlos has shared with us here. Just to give you a sense of who's involved on oil and gas, we have Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, Halliburton, GE, Shell, Cameron, Edison, Schwess, Baker Hughes, NOV, Weatherford, Caterpillar, Trimas, Cummins, and AES involved. And I'm probably missing people. On infrastructure, we have AECOM, GE, CH2M, Hill, Cisco Systems. We have Boeing here in the audience, which is working on aviation biofuels. We have a pretty robust group from which to draw our conclusions and opinions. First, some general comments about the Brazilian opportunity. It's one that I think U.S. investors view as a positive one in relative terms. Certainly, I think Brazil's energy demand, as Brazil's EPE projects it, will grow 4.7% per year. That's compares very favorably with the 0.8% growth per year that we project in the United States. Brazil is in a better position to pay for its projects than the United States is, certainly, and I don't need to go into any more detail on that, I think. Everyone knows the situation. In order for Brazil to sustain its economic growth, which is averaging about 5%, as Carlos pointed out, it needs ports and railways and airports and highways, or it won't achieve those levels of growth. And I think the government has made it clear that through the BNDES and other tools, it fully intends to build that out. Another phenomenon I think that attracts U.S. investors is the growth of the Brazilian middle class, which has driven airport utilization rates up by double digits every year for quite some time. 39 million people have moved into the Brazilian middle class during the Lula administration years, 2003 to 2011. That's basically the population of Spain. And so the strain on airports, the number of cars that people have bought, I mean, if you've been to Rio in the past few years, you realize it's now one of the worst traffic places on the planet. Telecoms, broadband usage in Brazil doubled last year, went up 100%. So these are the factors that U.S. companies are looking at and want to, and they're looking for ways to participate in that growth, financing, but also providing goods and services to help make it all possible. On the downside, I think one of the areas that probably is most concerning to U.S. investors is a bit of a step back in the direction of economic nationalism in Brazil. You have policies, for example, on government procurement now, by Brazil legislation that provides a 25% price advantage for domestic companies. That's a big number. 25% is a big hurdle to get over, and certainly gives investors pause. In the defense area, you have a law that was passed recently, 12598, that creates special defense companies. They haven't defined what those special areas will be, but in those areas, there will be only purchasing from Brazilian majority capital companies. There have been land ownership issues. Foreigners were barred from buying new land in Brazil recently. I believe that has now they've taken a step back from that. I'm not sure exactly what the situation is. Local content requirements in a number of industries, but notably we're here today to talk about energy, oil, and gas, is very challenging for foreign companies, particularly when they're trying to build projects that are very complex and like most projects all over the world, pull in parts from every place. I mean, it's a global industry, and then there's clearly a market concentration in the construction industry in Brazil in the hands of very few Brazilian companies, and it's not an accident that you don't see any foreign companies playing in a big way in the Brazilian market. If you look at highways, for example, OHL came into the concession market and came in with a very low bid, won, and was forced to sell their assets. I think mainly because they simply couldn't generate a profit with the price that they quoted. So it's a difficult environment to compete against local players for a number of different reasons. Specifically, I'll try and move through quickly through some of the specifics. There's huge interest in oil and gas in Brazil because Brazil has oil and gas, but a lot of the companies are there. ExxonMobil, Chevron, we all know is there. We'll see how much longer. Folks like Anadarko are in the exploration business. You have a number of U.S. companies that have set up. I've been really surprised to find the degree to which U.S. companies have built manufacturing operations in Brazil. People like Cameron, Baker Hughes, NOV, Weatherford. These guys have thousands of employees in Brazil already. There are huge opportunities in shipyards and in offshore maritime services. My company does some work developing some shipyards in Brazil, and there's a lot of activity there. There would be opportunities in storage and transportation, which will be necessary, except there's a monopoly, Petrobras monopoly there. But I think U.S. companies, I know specific companies are very interested in getting into that business if conditions, if legal and regulatory frameworks were put in place to allow for that. Even partnership. On the risk side, we're all aware of the Chevron issue. I think foreign companies are already a little concerned that the government's estimates of the cost for extracting oil from pre-salt is low. But then when you add the legal uncertainty of what the repercussions could be for a spill, even if it's a relatively minor one, as was the case with Chevron, it certainly gives companies pause. Pre-salt is very clearly the domain of Petrobras and Petrosal, and there's not a lot of space for companies, especially exploration companies, are very concerned to come into a project where they don't have any say in the operation of that project. So if Petrobras decides to take the operation in a direction that they think won't work, they're stuck, and they're basically portfolio investors. U.S. companies, I think, are not too concerned about local content except to the extent that they would like to see their education, their investment in education and training count toward their local content. Getting employees in and out of the country is difficult. Getting emergency parts into Brazil quickly is very difficult, and if a rig is down, that's $500,000 of cost a day. One area, and this is a question for you, is that I wanted to mention especially is natural gas. The United States is probably technically the leading country in natural gas technology. Our companies are very, at the cutting edge. Brazil, as you pointed out, now is estimated to have some significant shale gas reserves and is currently burning off a lot of gas at the wellhead offshore. I think it would be interesting for U.S. companies, and this would be a conversation that I think the Brazil Council would be interested in having with Fiesp, about the role of natural gas in Brazil's energy mix, particularly on the generation side. Brazil has a fantastic profile, green profile with its hydro, but hydro is only 95% reliable. So you roll, 1 out of 20 times, your dam will not be able to produce electricity, and so there's certainly, I think, an interest in if conditions were put in place to value the 100% reliability of contingency natural gas production. That would open a door for U.S. companies to come in and partner with their Brazilian counterparts. There's some other issues, importation of liquid natural gas, facilitating the licensing of that and putting the framework in place will be helpful. I'm going to try and move very quickly here, but in the renewables area, of course, Boeing and Embraer are partnering on research in aviation biofuels, but U.S. companies have not been very present in the renewables market in Brazil. You don't see them in biomass generation, for example, and my understanding is that the current subsidy structure makes investment in bagasse-based biomass generation difficult to pull off financially. Solar, the latest is that I think this is an EPE study, if I'm correct. The cost of solar is 602 reais per megawatt hour versus 118 per megawatt hour for hydro. So that's a big subsidy gap to make up, and I don't think the Brazilian government feels that it's ready to foot the bill for that.
Not 118, but 90 for hydro and 6 something for solar. Yeah.
On hydroelectric, which is a big opportunity, I think U.S. companies are more interested in the transmission side than in participating in building the dams. Building the dams is very political. If you follow the Bertin, Belo Monte mess, the government is so directs it so closely that it requires U.S. companies to play a game that I don't think they're comfortable playing. But certainly getting the electricity from the dams to the consumption centers is very interesting. The U.S., I think, is ready and willing to work with Brazil on nuclear when Brazil decides to get it restarted, if and when. The U.S. has played a role in broadband telecoms, which I understand we have a backbone. We have a backbone auction to come. Ports is an area where U.S. companies would be interested, but the transition from the Lula to the Rousseff administration was pretty rough and derailed a vessel traffic management system program that U.S. companies were interested in seeing move forward. So I guess the overall message is there's a lot of interest in the Brazilian market, but in specific areas. It's not broad, and the Brazil Council is working closely with our partners in Brazil, like Fiesp, to try and help move forward on frameworks in these areas that make the conditions attractive for investment in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Reeve. Chris, being the last, you have the advantage of being able to pick and choose on whatever you want to comment or add.
Yes. No, thank you. First and foremost, thank you, Paulo, for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to come here and speak, and delighted to be able to participate in the panel with kind of distinguished colleagues. And Paulo is absolutely correct. Being the last to speak, you certainly have the advantage, particularly in a context where we have such a good and comprehensive overview of kind of the energy and infrastructure landscape, that we just talked about now. So what I wanted to do and focus my comments here today is really try to do two things. Number one, I kind of wanted to at least convey, from where I'm sitting, how I see debate within Rousseff's administration to tackle some of these energy and infrastructure challenges on the one hand. And I think that there's some good news that and positive developments in terms of from a policy perspective that can make the investment environment more attractive, to foreign companies and the private sector more broadly, right? Second, I kind of wanted to highlight maybe debate and challenges that the administration really isn't tackling in a material way in terms of what are the new debates and policy, let's say, advances that need to be taken. And then I kind of wanted to turn to Carlos and have my questions around those two different buckets to see, at least from his perspective, whether what's he seeing in terms of prognosis for on both fronts. So, starting with the first point, what is the current debate within the administration and what's new. I think that first and foremost we have to recognize that Brazil right now is in a potential pivotal moment. I mean, we've had average GDP growth rates in a very robust fashion, preceding the global financial crisis, and then a very quick recovery thereafter. But over the past month and a half, 2 months, there's been a dramatic downward revision of growth prospects for this year. Economists are now forecasting a GDP growth rate of 2% if we're lucky, and growth rates for next year are also being revised downward. And the big debate right now in Brazil is whether or not there's something structural going on, whether or not the economic growth model, premised upon consumption growth has reached its limits, and the cumulative measures that include economic nationalism, incremental protectionism, and is starting to catch up from an efficiency point of view. And the global investor sentiment towards Brazil was turning negative in a very quick fashion. I think that this is, I feel that very clearly from our client base here at Eurasia Group. And now, how is the administration responding to this environment? And I think that the good news is that, I just got back from doing the rounds in Brasilia and Rio with upper-ranking government officials, is, I got a strong sense within the administration that they're going to turn to private sector investments in transport infrastructure in a more aggressive fashion. If you look at the first quarter GDP growth numbers, the big lesson within the administration is that investments, both public and private, have really been a drag on growth. And so I think that if we saw something new in the Rousseff administration in putting for auction the main airports, within the first year, the 3 major airports, I think that this is going to be an administration that's going to aggressively turn towards the private sector in terms of the concession framework, not only in a new round of airports in terms of the government very well announced, but the big initiative that the administration is working on right now is to reformulate the regulatory environment for ports. And this is politically very tricky given the governance structures within Brazilian ports. But I think that the government is going to try to implement a new framework that can facilitate private investments in existing ports, and also establish ground rules for concessions for development of new port infrastructure. I heard within government that they're going to accelerate the program of concessions within federal highways. Rail, the government already moved on the regulatory environment. I think that one of the challenges the administration is facing from the public execution of investment side is that all of the corruption scandals within the administration that led to the faxina within the ministerios and all of these ministers leaving has generated an opportunity cost, because that really has slowed down the process by which you can actually execute some of these public investments, because you have significant turnover in a lot of these ministries. So there is a cost the administration is paying, but I think that's that'll be resolved over time, right? But I think that from the transport infrastructure side, I think we have a very good story. Number 2, I think that there's also another storyline here that analysts haven't really been duly aware of, I think, call attention to, is that the BNDES is changing its profile. The BNDES has been accused of funding domestic national champions in industry, but if you look at the profile and pipeline of projects that the BNDES is going to be pulled into, it's increasingly going to be pulled in to fund infrastructure projects. The percentage of outlays for infrastructure projects in the BNDES last year in comparison to industry grew. I think that that's going to be the trend line going forward. And in the BNDES, they actually expect that their outlays for direct investments in infrastructure projects is going to reach 32 billion reais this year, and it was 19 billion reais in 2011, right? So I think that the BNDES will be increasingly an infrastructure bank going forward and less a funder of domestic national champions, which from an investor perspective, I think is something that will be well viewed. Now, what do I see as some important debates that really haven't begun to occur, but I think need to? I think that the big one really is in the energy sector, right? And I think that there has been a paucity and lack of public and policy debate over the government's new exploration and production framework to develop the pre-salt. Right? This was a proposal which the government substituted the existing concession framework with production sharing agreement contracts. The government implemented a rule that Petrobras will be lead operator for all new exploration and production development in the pre-salt province. And essentially, without getting into the details of the project, it was a decision to restrict the development of the pre-salt to the operational and financial constraints of one company, right? And the administration kind of sold to the public the view that you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have very aggressive local content requirements to develop a local oil service and supply industry and to provide inputs to the exploration production activity. You can have one company being lead operator for all new E&P activity. And you can have extremely ambitious production targets where, the government is planning to more than double production by 2020. And you can generate a lot of revenue. Well, you can't have all those things at once. And so I think that one of the debates that will emerge is that policymakers are going to have to make some strategic choices. Are they going to live with a world where you're going to have continual downward revisions of production, forsake revenue, have less investments in the name of developing a local industry and protecting the strategic position of Petrobras? Or are you going to open up the sector to more competition, more companies coming in, give more flexibility in local content in order to be able to have higher production? I think that debate has not begun. And my estimation is that that's the debate that's going to come in Rousseff's second administration. I don't see it coming now. But we're starting to see the inklings of these trade-offs, particularly with the pressure of Petrobras and their downward revision of production forecast. So I kind of wanted Carlos to maybe comment on how he sees these trade-offs that the government has made, but has not really been debated publicly, and whether that's something that he also sees coming down the pipe. Second, I think that there may be some issues as well on the regulatory side that need a little bit more debate. The interesting thing, and particularly when you talk about the Chevron incidents, I think that really brought to light, and it really hit a nerve. I'm actually of the view that the whole Chevron spill, and at least from the foreign view, the overreaction of the political class and the tremendous scrutiny that Chevron faced on a relatively minor incident, I think is symptomatic of the fact that in a post-BP Macondo world, there is anxiety over whether Brazil's ready to deal with a oil spill on the one hand. There was some frustration on how Chevron handled the incidents. But I don't think that this was an anti-foreign company sentiment within the administration. I think that a lot of the hyperbole that we see came from actors independent of the administration. But I do think that this raises an issue, which is, that there has to be a more mature debate within the administration over how to prepare for catastrophic events, and like a large oil spill. And the one kind of unnoticed element here, which I think is part of the debate that needs to go forward, is actually has to do with the sector of reinsurance. I mean, one interesting component, if you look at over the Lula's administration and the Rousseff's administration, there's been steady progress on microeconomic reforms that sometimes go unnoticed, but have very important repercussions. Not only in terms of developing the real estate sector, that the reforms that were approved there. There were reforms approved to create a positive credit bureau, and there was also one reform approved in 2008 that broke the monopoly of Brazil's reinsurance sector, and essentially the state monopoly of IRB, the Brazil's Reinsurance Institute. Now, so in theory, that's a very important provision to be able to have foreign capital coming in, and really to mitigate some of the potential downsides, financial losses of catastrophic events. But what the administration did in 2011, 2010 is backtrack from the opening of the reinsurance sector by establishing very strong local provisions and restrictions on foreign capital coming in to be able to participate in the reinsurance sector. Now, why is that important? Because if we do have a catastrophic loss in a very large oil spill, it means that all the financial costs associated with that spill will be concentrated in Brazil and not dispersed globally to other insurance providers, which is really, if you look at the way in which the Gulf spill in the U.S. occurred, most of the payments were really just distributed amongst global kind of reinsurance companies. So this is another example of how a policy focusing on domestic national champions, in this case IRB, right, and backtracking, is actually a step backwards in terms of how to actually think about some of these energy challenges. So I just kind of wanted to conclude here with Kyle's kind of directing some questions to you, right? Number one, do you, in looking at the government overtures in transport infrastructure, and let's assume that the government will in fact move in a positive direction, do you think that these efforts are, how far do they go in meeting the infrastructure deficit that you just highlighted? Because if you look at the BNDES investment forecast, they usually talk about a doubling rate of investments in most of the elements, but that seems to fall well short of the requisites of what Brazil, quote unquote, needs. So I kind of wanted to get a sense from you as to, is the government doing everything that it can right now? It's just a matter of time to be able to catch up, or are there other things that you think the administration could do to be able to overcome this deficit, number one? Number two, in terms of the pre-salt, I mean, how do you see these trade-offs and at least the viability of such a strong local content program with Petrobras being lead operator, if that in fact means much less production, right? And number three, I was very curious to see the fact you put the unconventional gas and kind of the shale gas, potential reservoirs in Brazil, because I think that there's been a lot of talk in Argentina whether they're going to explore their shale gas development, but Brazil actually has substantial potential reserves as well. Mm-hmm. From what I heard in the Ministry of Mines and Energy, I think that there is a working group right now talking about doing a bid round in unconventionals and shale gas, and most likely that's going to be the 12th bid round after the government does the 11th. So I think that's actually a very interesting development. But that's really the first time I actually heard debate on how to develop the shale gas potential. So I'd like to see from the industry perspective, that has kind of significant repercussions in providing a cheaper source of fuel for industry as well and meeting Brazil's gas needs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So we are already on Q&A session here we have made that transition. Carlos, why don't you start us off with answers? Please, let's everybody try to be brief on their answers and on their questions. I'll come to you as soon as he is over.
Well, I'd say I'll start by the transportation sector. In 2003, there was an energy reform in Brazil by a project of law that created a company, a very small state company that plans the energy sector in Brazil. It's called EPE. That company makes a 10-year plan every year. And it's not one 10-year plan today and then we forget it. 10-year plan each year, forecasting the next 10 years. And with that planning, we have the auction systems in Brazil to buy new projects of energy in generation, transmission, and distribution. This is one of very sophisticated public system in Brazil, which led to a investment in energy in Brazil up to more than 70% done by the private sector. And the state-owned companies like Eletrobras system, when they participate in the auctions, they behave as private companies as well. It's not money from the budget, the public budget. It's money from these companies. So, in in electricity sector, we have things going well in Brazil. Then we have the problems that Fiesp is very known in Brazil for fighting against high prices, high taxes that we have. But this is another problem. So this is something that is working very well in Brazil. So what I really wanted that President Rousseff would do when she started her government is, because in transportation, people that are building railways are not talking to people that are planning highways. People that are taking ahead the administration of ports are not talking with people of highways. And it's the same case of energy. If you talk in energy, you talk about projects of hydropower generation, projects of wind generation. It's not one minister that takes care of hydropower, another of wind generation, another of cogeneration. So, what was my hope? My hope that in transportation, President Rousseff, when she took power in 2011, she could have called the Minister of Energy of Lula who put in place this new model for energy sector. That was the Minister Dilma. But Minister Dilma never talked to President Rousseff. So, answering to your question, I don't understand, and I do not understand, I'm not hopeful that they are doing the right thing, because what we saw is all the wrong things that have been done in the Ministry of Transportations and many others. And corruption took this area in Brazil in a sense that's it's preoccupying. Talking about Petrobras, I say to you here, and that was our official position as Fiesp, that the changing for the system of paying for this concession to production sharing was something that was something that we should do, because it is a lot of money and richness that the country never had before. This is something that any government would do, and could have been done in the other system by raising the participation taxes, but they decide to go that way. Okay, that was the least important. The importance, what doesn't fit in this model is to transform Petrobras as the sole operator. Because if you have 60 to 70 to 80% of participation on the oil revenue, doesn't matter who is drilling. Doesn't really matter. So, what we said back in 2008, 2009, when this discussion was taking place in Brazil, is, okay, let's see how long Petrobras will handle 200 billion investment year, investment plan, 250, 300, 350, 40, 400. It's not going to happen. Every 4 years we have elections in Brazil. Every 4 years, the situation is that Petrobras is not going to handle the situation, and we are going to open for foreign operators to drill oil, petroleum in Brazil. It's a matter of time. 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, but it's just a matter of time.
Okay, we have two predictions already here. One, that President Dilma Rousseff was going to be reelected. It was made by Chris. And now that we are going to revise the regulatory framework and open. So with that, I'm going to open now for questions, and please identify yourselves. I am going to actually collect 2 or 3 questions at a time, and keep them short, please, and also the answers.
Hi, thank you. Raymond Power. On that topic of the regulations, Reeve, you mentioned something about U.S. companies involved in maritime storage and transportation, and they're looking for some changes in the regulation. If you'd be able to expand on that. And Christopher, you talked about some new ground rules for ports and highways, and if you'd maybe expand on that as well, please.
Okay, next to you, please, and then we move.
Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and this is to Carlos. You talked about the submarine cable system that's being set up from South America out to the world, the $884 million investment. If you could expand on that a little bit, will that be domestic, or is that going to be opened up to the international market? And then also about the optical ring from South America to North America.
Yeah, let's go on this side. 2 questions. Hughes, there. Right.
Hugh Schwartz, one-time resident of Curitiba. I have concerns about two things, one of which is relatively macroeconomic and not being mentioned, and the other is fairly nearly macroeconomic and not much being mentioned, and it seems to me these may be affecting investment decisions. The clearly macroeconomic decision factor is Brazil's exchange rate rose sharply for a number of years, and it has now in the last year and a half declined sharply. Presumably will rise up again, will appreciate again when growth in China accelerates again. But how is this affecting investment decisions? And the second question, the second factor is costs. The initial reaction that the costs of exploring the offshore oil and gas reserves were going to be much less than some people were concerned about. And this was not only the position of Petrobras, but also the international capital markets. Now there is a reversal on this, and it's concerned that it's going to be they're going to be much higher, these costs. And indeed, one of the leading Brazilian entrepreneurs has gone into bankruptcy on the basis of this. What is the consequence of all this for private investment from foreign sources?
Okay, I think we have enough on the table. Why don't we start? Carlos, can you please start us off?
Well, the submarine cable is already from Fortaleza. This is already contracted. It's being done. The optical ring in for Coziplan. In Brazil, concession. This is public project. Is to be by the government's purchases system. And certainly will be linked to a Brazilian company in the sense that the company that's present in Brazil that will provide the service and provide the work and the cables itself and all the things that. But it will depend. In South America, I try to organize my speech here today. Trying to give you this broader perspective of the continent, because we now are facing new problems, interesting problems, like how we deal with that, how we deal with the railway that is going to go through four or five different countries, how we regulate traffic, how we regulate taxes, how we regulate borders. This is something new for South America. It's not new for Europe, which is probably has the most important experience in integration. But certainly, in this perspective, Brazil is facing new problems. Brazil and South American countries. Facing new problems that are in a higher quality of problems.
Well, who would like to tackle? Reeve, you want any of those that you would like to tackle?
Sure. The first is oil and gas storage and transportation. So Petrobras has a monopoly on importation of oil and gas, which was recently broken by OGX just before it lost half of its stock value in a day because it didn't turn up to have any oil in its reserves, and storage and transportation, wholesaling and transportation via trucks or pipelines of fuels is also a Petrobras monopoly. There are U.S. companies that are engaged in that business and would like to invest in the Brazilian market that cannot do so because of that structure, and I think would be interested in. If Carlos's prediction comes true and we have foreign investors exploring, producing, and operating their wells in the pre-salt, why not also look at opening up transportation, importation, storage? I think it would be very, very attractive, and there's some big companies with lots of money to put into Brazil. On the exchange rate, I talked to a lot of companies that are looking at investing in Brazil, and the change in the exchange rate is a recent thing. So I think most of the investments coming through the pipeline now are things that have been in the pipeline for a while. Certainly, we're talking about from 150 reais to the dollar to 200 reais to the dollar, so it's a 12.5% discount. That certainly helps, but I don't think it's driving people's decisions. And on the cost of exploring offshore oil and gas reserves, certainly you don't see any companies clamoring to invest in pre-salt anyway under the current regulatory scenarios. I mean, if they with the sole operation thing, but I think that certainly from the perspective of asset managers, Petrobras' stock took has taken a pretty big hit as the costs rise. So it looks less and less attractive as the reality of what it costs to develop these reserves becomes clear.
Okay, I think here's one thing that I think we've mentioned, OGX. Is this what you were having in mind when you said some Brazilian company going bankrupt?
The leading private entrepreneur who set up something in the oil and gas area.
Yeah, but it's wrong. It's not bankruptcy. They lost market value. The shares lost market value, but it is still valued at many billions.
The main point was that this leading Brazilian entrepreneur,
Yes.
as the international capital markets, was misreading these important costs.
I
Well,
thought it was more an issue of what he said he would be producing by now versus
Yeah,
what he's really
it's-
producing.
Yeah, I think that was. I mean, that's more of an issue of geological risk. OGX was very ambitious and bullish in terms of their production forecasts and the size of their reserves. And they drilled, and they just found less, and they revised downwards in a material way their production forecasts. And there was also loss of confidence from investors over the credibility of management in terms of what they were signaling to investors before versus what they in fact delivered. So I think that's a little bit of a different. I mean, it's important, but it's a little bit of a different, reason for. But
just about it. At the end of the day, OGX is there working. The money in the bank is there. They are making money. What they have lost is value on market. But that is something that if they drill 100 meters to the right and find oil in a quantity, the prices go up, because this is, of course, on that company specifically. There is also a lot of romanticism around, but anyway, it's important also for us that this huge private sector company in oil moves forward.
Yeah, and just at least on my end, just quickly. I mean, I think when it comes to, the port regulatory overhaul, I think that the attention within the administration is really on two different buckets. Number one is to create a new concession framework to put the constructions of new ports under a competitive bidding process, because right now the structure hasn't been that. It's essentially, if you want to build a port, you can come in and get a permit, but then you have to use it primarily for the distribution of your own products as a company, right, rather than third parties. Yeah. So I think that the idea is to create a framework for constructions of new ports and put it on a competitive bidding process and be a little more aggressive. But the thornier issue is how are you going to change the regulatory structures and governing existing ports, and particularly with wharves whose contracts are expiring. Are you going to have greater conditionalities on existing investments? Are you going to put them up for auction as well? And here I think that the overtures are going to be more piecemeal rather than wholesale, right? So those are the two arenas where the government, I think, is working on. And the governance of ports is a politically very thorny, because it includes local unions, local governments, private sector, and the governance issues around that aren't easy to get fully around. But I think that the broad idea is that the government is trying to find ways of having more private investments to port infrastructure. When it comes to foreign exchange policy, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that this is an administration that has been very concerned with the appreciation of the real, and they have moved aggressively in implementing measures of capital controls in order to be able to devalue the currency. I think that the predicament that the administration now lives is be careful what you wish for, right? Because I think that we have to separate two buckets of investors. One are kind of companies that are doing foreign direct investment in Brazil, and there I think the level of the currency doesn't really impact. What really matters, I think, for foreign companies, in the real sector is what are Brazilian growth prospects. So there, I would say that the flow of FDI in Brazil is much more, dependent upon what is the new equilibrium growth rate in Brazil. Are we actually headed to a lower equilibrium growth rate, or is this a cyclical movement? And that's a very important issue, I think. But from a portfolio investor point of view, the sentiment has turned very sour. And because I think that what happened is that when the government implemented the IOF on derivatives trading and implemented the IOF on foreign fixed income inflows, I think that it really kind of generated a perception amongst foreign investors that, Brazil they don't want us. They don't want our money, right? And that kind of perception in a context where the world is getting worse and, global risk aversion is growing, right? It means that if the global environment turns further south, that the capacity and ability that the Brazilian government is going to have to take more aggressive measures to gain back that confidence. And I don't necessarily see the administration even coming close to that, because right now with the administration, the level of the currency is they're comfortable with this equilibrium. But the point is that if global events turn south, I think that it could quickly move beyond 210 into 230, 240, then the government's going to have to either defend it through very aggressive dollar spot interventions and unwind some of the capital controls that they did. But if you unwind them in a context where the world is already in crisis mode, it's not as effective if you were to do it. So that's the delicate equilibrium. And just very quickly on the oil side, I agree entirely. I think that the government will. The issue is not the production sharing agreement contracts; it's Petrobras being lead operator. And one of the repercussions of making Petrobras lead operator is that Petrobras becomes, an actor in favor of delaying bid rounds. Because if they're going to be lead operator for all new contracts, and they're already overstretched with their existing portfolio, there's going to be a natural tension between Petrobras on the one hand saying, hey, hold the horses, don't go quickly, and the government wanting to do bid rounds. And the reason why Congress has not approved the new oil royalty distribution revenue bill, it's not because Congress can't agree, it's because Planalto doesn't want it. And why doesn't Planalto want it? Because they're in no rush to do new bid rounds. And this creates a dilemma in the industry because you don't have a pipeline of new E&P acreage for companies. Exxon no longer has a concession. Shell's going to have to give up their concession. And when you don't have new concessions coming in the pipeline, it's very hard to keep your operations in the country because the profitability of your operations not only depend upon the profitability of your existing acreage, but expectation of future acreage. So I think it's very important, though, whether Brazil changes the framework in 10 years or 3 years or 5 years, because the opportunity cost from a production perspective is just growing over time.
Yeah, which goes to show that what Winston Churchill said once about the United States also applies to Brazil. I'm not going to repeat what it is. If you don't know, I'll talk to you later. Yes, a question over there.
Stakis Maragidis, thank you very much. Just a comment on going south. I think since we talk about Brazil, Mr. Christoph Roy may revise the concept going south, right? But my question is for Mr. Cavalcanti, and thank you for your presentation. In terms of infrastructure in the telecom area, you mentioned the plans for connections outside Brazil. What about the internal telecom market and prospects, especially as it relates to IT infrastructure in the internal Brazilian market and the structure of the IT market there in terms of infrastructure? Thank you.
Any more? Okay. Could you please answer that question, Carlos?
This is I'm not a specialist in it in this, but what is interesting is that all the framework, the legal framework existing in Brazil for the concessions in telecom were for the telephone that we had in our homes. The technology moves so quickly in the sector, and for God's sake, government cannot go in the same speed in making rules, and so this is the most privatized sector in Brazil. I believe that the problem we have there is lack of competition. We have 4 big companies. These companies, as there is almost 60% of taxes on telecom services, they are strategic for the government the tax collection, but they are not. The services exists is good, is of good quality, and is all over the country. The prices are high, and the quality of services is bad, very bad. But this is a problem of us and the companies that are operating in Brazil. It's strange how many American companies have been there and have gone out, going away. We stayed with one Brazilian company, the Mexican Claro, the Italian team, and Telefónica, the Spanish Telefónica, and that's all. But they are huge. They are very huge, and this is a model that I would like to go to see in other sectors, because here is by now 100% private. The government is planning. From time to time, they start talking about the Telebras again, coming back of Telebras again. Yes, I don't believe it's a brass infection, but from times to times they. Well, what we have, everything we've discussed here in oil is the interest of Petrobras. It's what's good for Petrobras has to be good for everybody in this room, because Petrobras is going to do the way they want it. We have the most expensive natural gas tariff in the world, in Brazil. We have one of the cheapest gasoline price in Brazil, because the government makes Petrobras doing that for the inflation rates and for the population. But it's a problem. I believe in free market, so I would love that to have competition in the oil sector, and tanking and transportation and everything that's linked to that. And I believe that we are moving. I cannot say if it's in 3 years, probably not in 3 years, probably not during this government, and if your prediction is right, not in the next 6 or 7, but...
Okay, I think we have one last question over there, sir, please.
I'll stand up.
There also, okay.
My name is Gordon Bischoff from Westinghouse, and I know the focus of this has been oil and gas and energy, but I have a question about nuclear. During the Rio +20, there was some interesting statements made by government officials, confusing, contradictory from my perspective, about nuclear as a part of the energy matrix for the base load for Brazil. I just wonder if you could provide your perspective on, do you think this is a realistic possibility for Brazil in the future? And how maybe predict how far in the future, if it is, please.
Okay, could you move the mic to here? And there will be the final here by Diego.
Hi, I'm Clara Marcus from the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. And I have a question about COSI Plan. You showed a graph illustrating 3 different pathways connecting essentially west to east. And I'm just curious to know, what were the environmental concerns factored into devising this plan? And are there any concerns about future development, specifically in the Amazon region? Because if we begin to allow development, it's been obvious that it's really difficult to enforce environmental regulations in the region. So when devising this plan, what were the environmental factors considered and future concerns? Thank you.
Okay, and final question by Diego Bonomo.
Diego Bonomo with the Brazil-US Business Council. Hearing Reeve and Chris talk about the necessity of reforms of the legal and regulatory framework in different infrastructure areas, I was thinking about the design of institutions. We all know that the federal government plays a key role in pushing for investment in the infrastructure sector in Brazil. So my question is, what to do with the Ministry of Transportation? Every Brazilian knows that the Ministry of Transportation, as was mentioned here, has a huge problem in terms of corruption, inefficiency. Up to a few years ago, there was even a lack of a career for infrastructure analysts in Brazil. So the question is, what is the source of the problem? Is it lack of enforcement? Is it the design of the federal government? So, do we really need a secretariat for ports separate from the Ministry of Transportation? Or is it a more structural problem that involves the Brazilian political system? So, as every president needs a congressional coalition, every president needs to share the ministries with the different parties, and transportation keeps going to the, in my view, wrong hands all the time for many, many years. So this is one question, and related to this, when I heard Chris talking about BNDES and the shifting the pattern of financing, it sounds like BNDES is going back to its original purpose as an infrastructure financing bank or infrastructure development bank. And the question is, should Brazil have a separate infrastructure bank as is proposed in the United States? I remember that a few months or years ago there was a debate about export promotion in Brazil, and there was this whole talk about creating the Brazilian Exim Bank, and a lot of infight between finance and MIDIC on who should manage the bank, and eventually nothing happened. So in this case, do we need new financing mechanisms?
Okay, so we have a question, first of all, on the nuclear sector. Who would like to tackle that?
I can do it. On the nuclear, the answer is no. Nothing is going to happen. If you remember past years, Minister Lobão, each week he announced more and more, the construction and more 2, 4, 6, 17. My last count was 77 nuclear power plants in Brazil. Nothing is going to happen if we don't change the constitution, because I don't know why in 1998 constitution it is a monopoly of the state to invest in nuclear power plants in Brazil. This is unbelievable for what we have in the energy sector in Brazil, that everybody in the private sector can invest in any project, but on nuclear, it's forbidden for the private sector to invest and to run a nuclear power plant. So the government each year puts money on the budget for the projects, and this is the first thing that they cut off. So,
Carlos, just to clarify, Angra 3 is nothing is going.
No, it's going. Angra 3 is going to be.
It's being built.
Yeah.
Okay.
But new ones, like Westinghouse would be interested, is not going to, in my opinion, is not going to happen because they put money on the in the budget every year, and this is the first thing that they cut off, and they don't.
And I would also just add that there is also the ripple effects of what happened in Japan did act to slow down even the little momentum that there was within the administration, right? And I think that, and the other constraint is that Brazil doesn't really need nuclear from a power source, right?
No.
So the decision within government to reactivate the nuclear program was more strategic, given that Brazil has high uranium deposits on the one hand, and a long-term view to diversify the energy mix. But that's all been slowed down by these recent events.
Carlos, on the question about especially the northern corridor of integration, the Amazon.
Brazil has 8.5 million square kilometers. It's bigger than the continental U.S. You probably know that. 66% of Brazilian territory is preserved as natural forests. And it's not preserved because we forgot to go there. It's preserved because they are huge and strong and laws to preserve this part of the territory. But people forget that in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, live up to 25 million people. It's the population of most of the countries in the world, more than 100 countries in the world. So these people have to live, and these people have the right to have kids and to grow their family and to have a viable way of living. So I would be very careful to rebuild the Transamazônica road in Brazil again. But we are talking in this project here to a waterway. It's a natural, as I told last week in Lima, was in Lima in Peru, I said, well, in this project here, the part of Brazil is already done. It's the Amazon River.
We build that.
We do not depend on all the mass on the transportation ministry over there. We depend on ports and things like that. But I can assure you, on the Brazilian part, that we have today one of the most, you could say sophisticated, I could say one of the most draconian environment legislation in the world. To have a project of anything licensed in Brazil, it's a mess. It's a nightmare. We take, for big projects, 3 to 4 to 5 years going around all these institutes, Chico Mendes, IBAMA, and this and then, and you pray not to find a small piece of old ceramics because everything stops if you are, because anthropologists have to come and to make their survey. It's something that is really, because the country has a right and very clear conscience of preserving the forest. What I don't see is other countries in the world doing the same that Brazil is doing. And to finish on that, because it's not only preserving, because recovering is also possible. With the Mata Atlântica, that was 1/3 of the Brazilian territory. We reached in the 80s only 7% of its original area, only 7%. With the creation of reserves and moving population from mountains and like this, now we have untouched recovered and keeping untouched 22% of the original territory. It is the most beautiful forest we have, the Mata Atlântica. So Brazil is doing its homework on that very hard, but we have to reconcile that with human development and economic activity.
Yeah, and that's in the most populated areas of the country, by the way, the Mata Atlântica. Now, on Exim Bank, that notion separating.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that I don't think you really need a new design. At the end of the day, the BNDES will have a certain limit in terms of the amount of credit it can allocate on a portfolio basis. There are, in theory, the funding constraint is limitless because the government essentially lends money to the BNDES through loans from the Treasury, and you can keep on doing that without increasing your net per GDP ratio. What it does, it increases your gross level of debt per GDP. But the government can still have more room to lend to the BNDES. But I think that there is a view within the administration to try to be able to hold overall credit lending, constant in real terms. So to not grow too much because that has a crowding out effect in the private sector. Then the question is, well, given the huge pipeline of infrastructure projects, and these are long-term projects, the BNDES will be pulled naturally to fund these, and so it will have less resources to fund industry. I think that's essentially what's going to go on, but I don't think you need to change the institutional design. And just a quick comment here on the Ministry of Transports, right? Yes, the Ministry of Transport has been a traditional fiefdom of political appointees, but I think that there is something new going on, which is, the corruption scandal broke, the PR lost the ministry, and Rousseff nominated the Secretario Executivo, who is not a politician, and he continues to run the Ministry of Transports. The PR threatened to leave the coalition if they didn't get it back, and she said, let me call your bluff. And they said, okay, we leave, but they didn't really leave. So I think that this is the leverage that the administration has to try to be able to slowly have more technocratic management with the ministry.
They said they would leave, but nobody believed.
Exactly. They called, let me call your bluff, and then it really was a bluff. And so, so I think that's something new, right? And that's leading to, I think, a better management. The more interesting questions actually I wanted to comment on, Carlos, is that your comments and the Q&A seem to suggest that what we need is kind of an EPE for transportation, which is an interesting notion. I think that would be more, aggressive. I think that the idea within the administration was for the PACI to play a little bit of that role. Because essentially the role of the Growth Acceleration Program was to centralize some strategic decision-making on execution of investments away from the ministries and put it within the Comité Gestor of the PACI. But that's only a half-baked step in that direction, if I read you correctly, right? So that's an interesting. I think that there maybe
because PACI is a list of jobs, a list of projects. It's not a planning system. What I insist is that we discuss here ports, but who is taking care of the roads roads and railroads that are going to get in and get out of the ports? Okay. If Tico doesn't speak with Teco, it's
you know who Tico and Teco are? I can explain that to you also later. Now, let me conclude here. Thank you very much for all of you for your participation. Diego, your question, which you're not. Which is on the ethics department. I think that the way to see that, and I like Chris' answers, believe it or not, there is evolution in Brazil and positive evolution in this area also. I always like to remind people that democracy takes a lot of work. Anything of improving countries. This country, from the end of slavery to emancipation of slaves to Voting Rights Act, it took 100 years. Brazil is improving in that area. I believe that all of you should stay tuned to the vote by the Supreme Court of Brazil on the Mensalão scandal. There is enormous pressure from society in Brazil, and that's how things normally get done in Brazil, because government responds to pressure from society in democracy. And pay attention. I don't want to make a prediction, but the Mensalão scandal, that was a very huge corruption scandal in Brazil, the outcome of that may contribute to progress in the end, in the chapter. Let's introduce accountability into the system. And I think we have started doing that, and I just wanted to, ask you to pay attention to this, to follow the decisions by every of our ministers at the Supreme Court who are in charge of judging the 40 people involved, including a former chief of staff in Brazil of the presidency. One final thing, when Carlos was presenting the idea of the networks, the integration of South America, I immediately came to me something that happened in the year 2000 that was very controversial at the time, and since this is the day we celebrate President Fernando Henrique Cardoso's accomplishments in Washington, D.C., it was about 12 years ago that he had the wisdom to call the first ever meeting of South American leaders, and people were absolutely appalled. What is he doing? And the justification was that, are you talking about integration? So we are talking about South American integration, economic development, and the first idea was to do something around, I think was called IRSA. There was a series of government projects in the region to integrate infrastructure. It's very interesting that 12 years later, you have the representative of a private sector industry association referring to this, because this has become, regardless of all the controversies that exist in South America and will continue to exist on the political side, the story that is really going on in South America, I think, as far as the Brazilian, especially Brazilian private corporations work, has to do with integration. You see more and more the presence of Brazilian companies in neighboring countries. You see more and more companies from some neighbors, not only immediate neighbors like Peru and Chile, but also more distant neighbors like Mexico. That's a major investor in Brazil. So it's a sort of, I'd like to end this, because it says something about wisdom, about a leader that, we are very connected, actually, with President Cardoso. He was, as I mentioned, one of the inspiring persons here at the Wilson Center, both in terms of the creation of the Latin American program, but also of the Brazil Project and later the Brazil Institute. And I wanted to end on that note by thanking you all, Carlos, Reeve, Chris, for being here, you in the audience. And we are going probably to take a break. We are not going to be very, very active during the last part of July and August, but we'll be back actually on September 7th. We should restart our program. In the meantime, what we are doing now, we are starting to using the talent of our wonderful interns right now, Lauren and Lizzie, to translate into English some of the excellent articles that have been appearing in the Brazilian media. And I would like to call attention for you to two of them, or three. One by a former scholar at the Wilson Center, Pércio Arida, now the chairman of BTG Pactual, the largest investment bank in Latin America, on the 18th anniversary of the Real Plan. That actually, the concept of that plan started with Pércio Arida at the Wilson Center in 1982. The second one is an article by Sergio Falso from the Cardoso Institute on the recent events in South America surrounding Paraguay. And another upcoming is about Mercosur with the integration of Venezuela by a former foreign minister of Brazil in town today, also for the Cardoso celebration, and a dear friend of ours, former foreign minister Celso Laffer, current president of the Science Foundation of São Paulo, FAPESP. With that, I wanted to thank you very much, and stay tuned.